who have been called here. So we hope to have a very meaningful conversation, and we will go bilingual because I think we don't have a mixed audience here. All right, but what is this topic about? What are we going to engage you with? This is something I need to introduce to the audience first. Okay, so I'll just give a short introduction. Now you know that the development of education in Mizoram is closely intertwined with its literary traditions, historical transformations, and educational policies. Understanding this growth from the perspective of literature, history, and education reveals how the state has moved from an oral culture to one of the highest literacy rates in India. Okay? The development of education in Mizoram is not merely the growth of schools, it's not merely the growth of number of schools and institutions, it is a cultural transformation shaped by literature, historical change, and policy intervention. The transition from an oral society to the one of the highest literary states in India reflects a unique synthesis of indigenous transitions and modern educational systems. Now, as already introduced, sharing the platform with me is a name which is synonymous with education. Everywhere you see educational development, you hear her name, and that is Professor Diktei. And another resource person we have is one of the biggest literary giants of our times, and this is Professor Margaret. And I think you are very, very fortunate. We are very, very fortunate to have them with us. Now, as I've said, I will be posing the questions in English, and they have the freedom to answer both in English or Mizo, or maybe in both bilingually. Okay? They can even add dashes of Hindi here and there. They are at a liberty to do that. Okay? So the role of education, my first question will go to Professor Diktei. After this, I will be sitting with them. Okay? So the role of education in the development of Mizoram is central to its social progress, economic growth, cultural preservation, and political awareness. Education has transformed Mizoram from a predominantly rural and subsistence-based society into one of the most literate and socially progressive states in India. It has brought about social progress, economic growth, cultural preservation, and democratic values. It continues to empower individuals and strengthens the state's path towards inclusive and sustainable development. Now, my question, Professor Diktei, can you explain how indigenous knowledge systems and oral traditions laid the foundation for modern education in India, and how has the introduction of formal schooling brought in by the Christian missionaries and colonial educational policies transformed Mizo society, and how far these changes have strengthened or weakened our traditional Mizo values? Ma'am, do I have to repeat it? Maybe we can start with one of the questions.
I don't know how I've been invited here in the Literature Festival, maybe because of some of my writings, which is not, I don't know, if Professor Margaret were to evaluate my writings, it will not have much of a literary value as a literature. But I always wrote from my heart, and I'm trying to educate people, being from education side. Now the question regarding the education and what has come after the Christianity, I must say. We always talk about education of the Mizos, which is, let me say, ignited by the Christian missionaries. But here, Of course, I agreed with that by saying that formal education started with the Christian missionaries who gave us our alphabets. And from then on, reading, writing, and handing over the traditions through written works have started. But it doesn't mean that education was not there before the Christian missionaries came, which, especially to the audience today who have come from IASE, I would like to say that as you have already studied, education is not all about reading and writing. So education was very much there even before the Christian missionaries came into Mizoram. Ni china khan kan soi Mizo tonga soi po kha aren chang tho kan tia wang khan ke chu Mizo tong ka tia Mizo kan ni chu sap tonga yan mo chu ba chan Mizo tonga soi na ren chang alo om hi ke ma tan chon ngom ka ti tu kan ni chu I kan tradition le he kan culture ati dal nge ati sak zo ti kha zo na kha oma ati sak zo na la ya oma ati dal na la ya oma ni ti kha ka soi dua because what happened was the missionaries were from the western countries and they brought in with them their culture and the education that they gave. Of course, we talk about the Roman script, and this has become very, very, how do I say, it has become so much inculcated in our minds, and they have come here to propagate Christianity, to propagate the salvation, and we end up, I don't know if if I use too strong a word, we end up worshipping them, maybe more than the God that they propagate. Let me stop at that for this time. Can say hold on ya nang ni po say to rin lawin din de ulat din ka so thank you so much.
We'll have a Q&A round where we can have you respond to what they've just said. Because by the end of everything, you might have forgotten what they said at the beginning. Okay? So we ask another question, we'll pose another question to Professor Margaret, after which we have a Q&A round. We'll take 2 questions from the audience and then go ahead with the next round. Okay, so be prepared to ask questions. These oral narratives transmitted moral values, social customs, survival skills, community history, and traditional storytelling sessions functioned as informal education systems. Now, Professor Margaret, if you could kindly tell us, how did storytelling traditions in Mizo society reinforce discipline, community responsibility, and social values? Number 1. Number 2, in what ways did these oral narratives preserve cultural identity and strengthen social cohesion? And what is the significance of translation in safeguarding and transmitting these indigenous traditions across generations and linguistic boundaries?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Masangi, and I'll make an attempt to answer it in this manner. Orality is something which is significant for every culture, and I think we all understand that, especially in Mizo culture, we have a huge history of the written aspects, but orality is something that has dominated, still continues to dominate also a larger part of our culture. Orality is important for each and every culture, and it's not just because we are a tribal culture, but every culture is is embedded within the concepts of orality. So the understanding, in a very significant nutshell, the understanding that we have about orality is something that I think we will all understand in terms of the folklore that we have, in terms of the folk songs that we have, the fashion sense that has been garnered from time to time, the accessories that we have had, also the dances, the song tradition. Everything is part and parcel of the ambit of orality. So when we talk about orality, it's something that is not written, but orality continues to dominate our lives even today as we are writing also. Because all these aspects, the very fact that we're having a literature festival here and we ask questions and are answering questions in orality goes to show how important orality is for all of us here as Mizos and also as people who are living in the 21st century. The other important thing is that it's something that cannot totally go away. So orality helps us to preserve our heritage. Today when we're talking about indigeneity, when the entire world is speaking about globalization, the world also comes back to the notion of orality because we're talking about indigeneity, we're talking about indigenous writings, we're talking about how to preserve our culture, we're talking about how to preserve our heritage. So actually, consciously or unconsciously, we all go back to paradigms of orality. Important for us. Mizoram pay swaning, kan folklore ang te, tuna kan Diktei kan ama subject education na jang kan tiang te kinaron sa ita English at jang te pon literature at jang te inhan kita ilangit Department of English and Culture Studies ami kan nita so kata jang kanin hindi lang kan thondu te ang te hi maurangi thondu te kan nita hailungi thondu te kan nita na mani generation po hanin siya part sa inivate siya matini po tunahanin kan upata Dr. Masangi kanin in generation so kan ron pak siya lawa in ay kan upata mase nang mani ang royal ka kan nive in ay po kan danaw pang VMM na sila yete po kan siya kan haya katinay kan naw pang kan nive lai shim po kanin kan 40 zahi kan siya beta ni so tunate po translation ni na beta kangate kanin Tulbura thontu te kan neta, pero mawrangi thontu te kan neta, thailungi te kan soita, remain hoyi te kan soita, pero katya ang zongsonga kanin, henga chong yanin avayin chelo maulang pakatali chung siya ti ka base, kanga chong te po kanin, mizo chung chang ka kan shitani, mizo le tuna te po yanin, namdang chung chang te kan soita, namdang kan ti yanin bigtakin mizo wajan, vai chung chang te nita, mase kang hun laya te po kan, mawrangi thontua te, remain hoi thontua te po khani kan oral tradition tu na kan ron soya khani namdang kha kan lo bai pui ve to ani tinchu ba ka environmental preservation chung chang te kan soita atero khanga te po khan ma lai chang te po khani how creation came to be te how rice came to be eaten te how the mountains and lakes were formed te khang zong zong ting wan tong ka te khang te po kha mizo thontua hian de mizo orality hian alo om chiang ta ni katilai khati tiang khan han chang tai la so na pathum ne na chuanin the significance of translation hi cultural aspect ni ta chong ne tong pong chong ne mai hi ni ta lo ta translation kan ti hian chuanin mizo to english antina mizo to english bonite english to mizo bonite tin nam dang chong dang te po a om thei ta ni chong khata khanin kan sha tu ra chu ha translation khanin in ting nge ke ma ni cultural heritage kha min hom hal sak ti lai kha apoi mo ta ni a tong he defect ko kem english hi ani a mizo tong chan ani lo ti lam pang al ma khan ani rual khan mo a primary aspect ka chu kan cultural heritage kha a pho chwa kem eng ang nam nge kan do ni chin eng anga re nge kan do ni eng anga hausa nge kan do ni ti lai zong sa ma te khanin orality te culture te translation te kha avai han a in pung kai hi boi na karon sei do ani no me
the storytelling bi ka khan oral literature kan ti abi ka khan ka pasal nei khan kan nei tanga khat ve la khan go ho ti a training ni min kal san ni ta chok ki ma khan kamungam cha lo wa kam mother-in law u pitar to khan ni non ria puya thon thu man lai mizo thon thu kha min sin na ni mo ta ngai to le hian ama chuang to lo a lu ka te lu to ka ni kha chang khan thu tak hi ka lo la sian mai lo kha ka zir be la ni mo kha kan kan chuan education be kha lo ni ya tin ne da bi Diktei na asoya khanin bi emi kan zir be like khanin research project work kam ne ya ta kan English hi kan zir na hi be to ni zo pe to primary school kan zira BA kan zira ne ta kan zir so master section pe to ma se one or two sentences in English po la tong ngam lo hi kan tam lu ki engia chan bi ha research ha kan bei ve ni so man soi pakada chuan ti te so ang khanin there's this tendency to see the whites as gods and to speak their language is something very difficult kara vai tong du dua kan ri sa ka ha he kan ha ti ve mai lai kan sa tong kha chu kan za ku thi na ni chu mo chu mi lai te chu aron soi chwa ta ka chuan kan soi za dua chuan I see a hand going up there yes
native narrative ni boka chu bang chuan English ka hmang lo mai nga mizo tongin zona pakhat na hi man diktei ta ni ya chu kum sa ka zakwa somli pali February khan Mizoram high school hong ve chawani ma zong khain high school phoi lam ka chu kan nei to kan nei na ka rai lu tu kan ni kum som li chuang vel kha chu tiang system ruat chong kan lo kala pha ya an zir cha cha ranga ya silonga zir chuak te le hun sang sang zir chuak te kha an tam ti ko kan sia kan history kan en chuan sumia ka zona lai chu kan education kan le kha an lo hlau ani zo ka ngen mi opet tu te ti ma yang khang ho kha ni achan chu sa ka zakwa som li palia independence nei dona kan nei ve thei chauta om sia bera chuani kami ma zong khanin an ma ni ina an chor tang kai thei tur chin chak education min lo pe te an theyangem tilai ka zo na lai ania tin men Margaret ka zo na lai le chuanin orality chungcha ha hianin orality hi soi thom hi kan ching to em maya iron interpretation ka du em atin orality chungcha ha hianin bu James Kota the art of not being governed le khabua sia khanin orality kha aron chan la sem em ni mizo te hi kan pi le kan pu te as Southeast Asian as a whole ang khana ron enta chuta chon illiterate lovin either it will be pre-literate or post-literate ang zong na ron kiran chuti ang zong chuanin chuti ang zong na kir chuanin kan mizo pi pu te khan an du wang renga literate ziak nei lo an lo ni thayangem orality kha chu fluid sia an du hun huna ta nan sia manga an hun la ya a context mila tang kai to lo kha chu an kalsan mai thei ni asen written da na om to chun an kalsan thei to lo ni kha aboi thak na lai ang khan argument na ron siam ta chu nang ma ang zong poi ipom zong ani am ti lai khan ni ta se chon hei hi chu a tu zok zok kon ni chang la poi ka ti lawa mizo na kan ti hianin tu na mizo te hi kan mizo to en ti la hi ka zona ni a chan chu culture te tradition te chu static turan ni lo ti hi kan sia ni a evolve zela a fluid em chu mizo nga chonin tu na kan mizo in chei dan kan ti te antinan hay men man Diktei aron ha kang si tapo a evolve fali mo antinan ni pa po in tu na chonin ke kor kan havek to ni mo khatiang zong en khanin thil evolve tur anga kan ngai na khanin tu na mizo te hi kan mizo to kan tina ka zo na ani
ka sei chak ben hi khana ka break ka fe lang ti ka lava break fe ti hi ni ning pia o ka ma sa lo khan article ka jak nge a tin mizo within bracket lo na ti poi article ka jak to ni wang lai ni pot swak to ik ka ring chu wang chuan mizo na le mizo lo na te ka sei chak zok tak ania tu na tak phei chuan mizo kani na hi kapa min te kania eng ang mi po pasala nei mai la mizo kani ti hi ka status sa klutu ma se alo screenshot le anga min dei ne loi ang ti ka lo wa ka status si lo ani ti ka abuta la kan soyanga John education chung cha nga khan a India ram ang pot sei ta ila British noaya omlai khane man magandi de ho koina an sei renga chu an man tu chin ba ka hi zirna an te du lawa chu wang chuan mi zong zong tang zirna kha pe kan ni ngai lo kan ni ti kha sei ani ya education he apik takin voina om ho pi zirlai ho chan in zir in karinga chu tia ang ani lai chon mi mizo ma khan sang ka chakwa somdi palia mizo high school mo atla te po kha ka sakya mo ma se ka salomanga mizo high school la loading tana chutin somdi pariata first matric candidate te tikha aw man hi bo la chutia chon mizo ma kha chon high school kha matric pas khasa kha zakwa somli pariata anom chau ani a mai ro chu tu na min zo na kha chu assumption ani lo thei lawa kan chan thei chi ani lawa i ke mani khamin du sak lo wang ani angem ti te ri ruwa a om a i an chot thei chin tu chau kha ani angem an ti te tia chu vai ram anga zir enge mo za chu kan nei thova ni missionary te na an chom ang chi kha anom thova khati la ya khan chu rin dan ani awang khan mino pui khan kan afford lo ani zir na kha chumi ni wang chuan entinan keimanu ngei te po Paul ruk apas nuwa chuan private in Paul ruk atang khan sikul kal to nia lovin matric exam ani nuwa chutiang ang te chu an lo ni a khatiang anga injil chove ho khan te niau min chwa chho ani le ta a mai ro chu ti ra ya chuan tun nuwa hete education ti te engemo education system ka nom nu yan sikul din satya ro thi masom na ani shan pa lo vani ti hi chu ataka kan mu tam tak chu ani thop ani chu ti ro le ro chuan tu na kan sei tak ang khan kan lo dai deu chu ani be in terms of education mo chu la ya chu ni ta chuan ni sina mi zo na la ya kha chuan kan thi sen le te kan ngai tua na te ami zo anga ya ti ka sei bek chin chu ni a kan in chei na chuan tu nei seng cha kan nei tu na po he lai hi anon omani maya ami zo em chong me ala mani chu a thi dan jong jong a ki ma se chu ke ko te kan ha mi zo anga lan de kan du sia mo ke chu kwan bi hi ka thiam lawa ni le ka kwan bi chuan la ya chuan ka chau ka ze ka chu wang chuan ka bi la mani ma se ka ri ru le ka ngai to na jong jong a ke ku ka mi zo he nom la wang ka ti ve chi na chu lai zo ka chu kan mi zo na chu ni ka sia a thil dang hi chuan kan education te hian thil dang tam tak min zir ti don Mizoram ya la ma kan la kal don ma se kan mi zo nei chu helai a hian a omangai chu mi zo na chuan enge temple ni chi na kan sei pre-Christian Mizo tradition Mizo values eng khangai kan ngai eng khangai min ti Mizo tu ani so chu Mizo ani so mole min ti tu hia omani mom nam dang pon Mizo ani so an ti thei enge mo hi chu values kha kan nei ni entilan tlom ngai na ti hi Mizo ta ani bi love kan ti china ma se Mizo ta ani bi zia hi he mi tlom ngai na kan sei bi ke hi kan tia nge vai ho po tlom ngai deu don om kan ti china ma se ni kum lok a khan ke ma na ka ton sia ta tlom ngai nei chu Mizo ta nge chu alo ni ti nei ka nei ni chu po chu zia tu ra ke chop me ka ni a ti tu na zia tu ra ka in ro man ne a tu pui ka nei to he ta ka ri ro me chu Mizo nge mi bo ti hi ni kan bo hi ka lao Mizo ho hi mo chu lai te chu a last question ka kan chang te lo ka Professor Margaret pon sei tu ra nei te rin ka ring
kan pi le tu te ina orality kha I think an ma ni choice en mi tiang deu kha mi sei ta tu ro kha ti la ya kha chu a hypothetical deu lekin ka sia a chan chu orality has never been a matter of choice. Because when we look at studies which are related to the concept of orality also, or orality per se, it is important to understand that every culture has been, like I had earlier said, being steeped in orality. Choice lo ti lampang. Ay makan ni tu na yan chuanin ini ang generation nang ni ang generation te po 21st century a yan chuanin orality a yan chuanin choice su kan nei tak ne wan ni du le kan sia ka nga tu le kan sia lo nga ti te po in mo khatia anga khanin mase khami hun lai tak taka khan chuanin way back then khata khan chuanin it was not a matter of choice. Kini na kan siya yam dan tu ra pe hi chu ke ma ni yanin abi takin Mizoram yanin the manner in which we have addressed ourselves, our own selves, our oral selves, or our written selves, thil dang dai lu tu kan nita chan chu entinan colonial te kan neita pero post colonial tradition te kan neita te kilaya poi mo hi chu subaltern ti te kan soita tunaya subaltern ti te kan kelta colonial te kan tia post colonial te kan tia chuan chu indigeneity te kan tia masa he milaya hianin kan fi khur em hi ngai ta ni khatilaya khanin asan chu khamilaya khan ke mani oral self zate po ka engtin nge kan va ma chon lai hilaya kha po aron shil ve tel te zel ta a mizo tan han chuanin can the subaltern speak kan ti lai hianin kini ang ka subaltern kan ni ta meu ta ni chan chu colonial domination na kan ambang khanin anita khatilai ka chu soi thui ta lo mai ta nangin masa kan syak to ra hi chu ke mizo ina kan trong chwa dan subaltern kan ni ta na hi dang ai hianin adang em ta a orality kan ti te po hi chu wang chuan dang lam ta a khami hun lai kha na bi tak khanin siak le chiar ti to top mai ang kan thiam ta bau lo ta ni ma se kan syak tu ra chu ke ma ni kha kan rama sa prong kal kha chu I missionary an ni a administrator an ni bok ta a kan lo pom em ta bok ta a ma se khamilaya kan thatna ni a chat na ane rwal khanin tun thing hianin kan oral culture te atam zo ka kha bo to ma silanin tun thinga ke mani ta na written paradigm te oral heritage kan ne te culture heritage environment ama sa ka ron soi ang khani khang zong ka ron kal na kha chu khami orality le kan colonial sowina min chom nung sak wang kha na ni a chu bang chan bi lai hi apoi mo ka ti em a inter khami ka fluidity kamo kan shat ya mangai bokani
mi pakhat chuan essay exam an nei dona thingkung write an essay on a tree ti kha chwaringa azit sar ma se write an essay on a cow lo chwak ta ma se amang ang do lawa one day I took my cow I took my cow out on the field. I tied it to a tree, and there are trees and tin kaziak like a character maybe and there. When I had saptonga narrative na iturin kanin buat saya. Amaro so namdanga namlawang we are going bilingual. Questions ero itu saptonga kan no ya sawa kan translate them lawanga mase kan ti ang kan kanin adapt zel anga Professor Margaret he conveying ay nanga atum adua athil ti to chu finish ti ani di ka changa HOD mi line English Department of Culture Studies atel dan ma na sa takinalani mo English and Culture Studies anilan asan to English ti ringot khan a scope ka te de chinabang khan kinin MA kan survey lai pot ingat nge ABC tu theng theng in the zeta ni ki mai ni khawa khan a shet yam lo tan chuan a scope kha azi man de thina ni so ba chuan veina hian culture studies atel theina turin mana sa takin ala a so my question is going to be on that how important is culture studies in education can elements of traditional oral learning still be integrated into modern education systems, and what might be lost when oral traditions decline in literate societies?
The manner in which we interpret English is on a very, once again, may I add, a very, very colonial paradigm. So the main reason as to why, when I was heading the department at that point in time, and I'm so glad that I've been asked this question because, we know it on an administrative basis back in the department and at the university, but to give it a very wider and a larger platform, I feel immensely proud to answer this particular question. When it was just Department of English, and it is Department of English in varying other contexts also for that matter, across the country, but especially when you take it to a larger ambit like Department of English and Culture Studies, you give that entire interpretation a very, very wide and a very liberal ambit. When we were, because when it was just Department of English at that point, whenever we had studies, whenever we had to present a syllabus, revise a syllabus, do a synopsis for an MPhil, in those days we had the MPhil, or a PhD, we were always asked, when we did works on, say, local authors, native authors, Northeast literature, or anything under the sun for that matter, the question that always came to us was, y'all are a Department of English, so why don't y'all stick to Shakespeare? Why don't y'all stick to John Milton? Why don't y'all do this, that, and the other? Names that which were archetypal, very significant of the English paradigm. But we had to move on for us to understand that it had to go to a wider literary ambit. So all our discussions, especially our Board of Studies, our DRCs, everything, school boards, was so wasted because we had to spend more than half the time in telling people that this was what literature was all about. Because the understanding for every person, and I'm talking about Mizos, I'm also talking about non-Mizos, the whole understanding of English is very, very limited. So you have to tell them what literature is all about, and that literature also encompasses culture studies. So it was with that particular idea that I had mooted, and the entire department, of course, backed me up, and this is where we are now. Important for us to understand this, and also to understand that, if it were not for orality, if it were not for things like translation, if it were not for things like culture studies, a huge impact, the huge impact that we all make, I'm not just talking about our department, that the huge impact that we all make in our lives will be very lost because things are moving on into a very significant interdisciplinary factor. And we have to be, our minds and our hearts have to be open to the fact that when we talk about a certain subject, a certain discipline, we have to incorporate sources from the other side of the firing line as well. This is what literature teaches us. It has to broaden our minds, it has to widen our hearts, and also our perspectives. Thank you.
As I always, I will say it again, you are all from Education Department, B.Ed students. NEP is a National Education Policy 2020, and it's a new education policy. NEP lampung kan National Education Policy ni, New Education Policy so ani AMA mase amma kan National Education Policy ni tika kan say tele tu hetiang mai ang chi haude walang hi injil tel si lo in lo thiam tel lawa inin me lo de kan china kan say tel kani. We talk about the policy which is an idealistic policy. If you go through the whole policy, you will find that there is nothing bad about that. But at the same time, there are certain things that you have to read between the lines. But even when you read between the lines, you have to try and interpret it for your benefit. Indian knowledge system, it should be indigenous knowledge system. Mizoram po State University to say chak makan say lavanga to tidana mo to interview amali say hichak ogya masakan say lavanga tiledai ang ka anita in sungai chin bi boy ka ve biawa. Anyway, NEP yani ECCE kati Early Childhood Care and Education atangin bulatanini. So tason Mizoram ni China kan soy colonial atangin missionaries and Western culture atangin minorities hawakan ti atanga kan som chauzel ma se chu tason Kothari Commission atanga 10+2+3 kal chaukan ni ta class 1 atang yan zirna bulchan angangai anita ni India na ma yan amay ro tu na NEP chuan preschool la yakha 3 years before class 1 aron ngai poi motani masehi mizozi nga chuan kan boy khak kan boy chho chan tu ran ta kha preschool education kha school lakal tu chuan we need at least 3 classrooms, we need more teachers alone ni ta chuan chumi ni wang chuan implementation kan sei po yan a hard tan especially when it comes to school education. And we talk about school education and secondary education. Secondary education at 9, 10, 11, 12, secondary education, top Asia and Tony. And in Mizoram, we have high school and higher secondary schools. Kan buhay din namin culture and hemi ke mani mindset ne na in zom tak ti ane wangin tu na hen 9 10 11 12 secondary angin ti don ta ila tu ngai thu zo kang te han kan boy le don so but say somehow we have to go through that so implementation of NEP 2020 hian Mizoram ne na in mil de chu learning through mother tongue kanitani so that even at the higher education level at any level if the state wants if the institution wants they can teach in the regional language di kanitani chu wang chuan Mizo tong po in zipina kalpui thei ania tuna phei chuan secondary education a begin science ti chuan Mizo tong le nin ani to ni nakina hi te pui kan study anga Mizo tong le nin ani huwa hian kan zilai te hian an thiam ta in ya hi zirtham ala ni don ni so that is one thing that we can take in and we talk about Indian knowledge system one thing that I would like to convey is that we are Indians although we struggle to be Nisina kan shobai kan saya karaiting pakhati na kinasan kalathonang katya karaiting pakhatan being an Indian from doubt to acceptance when we live end because ya kani ram ria kan boy lai takhan Indian liyan kan han in shebe te china kan han sina ari so ka kanama kan le de so kan Indian lo riau zel ni hiru chuti lai chuan Indian education system suwa kanama Indian knowledge system an soitani chuta chan ke chan ka argument chu we are Indians if you take us as Indians our knowledge system is also the Indian knowledge system why talk about Vedic all the time we can talk about our own traditional knowledge lalmanganu khan long roi ni kha asiani chu that was the knowledge that she gained somehow lalmanganu te chu kan sha phalawa ni chu mo lalmanganu long roi ni an ti kha eng tin nge alo shiat le they have certain kind of knowledge kha Indian knowledge system ani ve thawani it doesn't always go back to the Vedic area Vedas ni kher kha ani lo mo Humayun te kan sei kher lo ke mi zon sura te kan sei ni that is still Indian knowledge system ti kha ke mari ro om dan chu nya so what I would like to say today is that when we talk about implementation of NEP whatever is there in the policy Mizo tonga sei le chan ati thalai se kan la don ni chu a lap kha kan payang mo a lap kha om ve ni a lap tho kan payanga a ru e tlak lo kha chu kan payanga ati tha a thau le ti in pol mo anak lai kha kha ka te jon Mizo chon kan tui ti lai tak kha nya kan in rem lai nya khalai kha kan lak thiam chon it will be very good for the Mizo society it will be very good for the whole Mizo whoever is educated in as a Mizo and it's a Mizoram tan yan athabel le khak tu thi tam taka omani ti kha I don't know whether I'm answering the question and whether I'm to the point ka tui zong ani chon kalong sai le chi na mo nge apwan kha tam chi na apwan lo lai achunga kha mo la te kan ina achung ai chon achung kha achung lai kan lo le tiam tu ra ka ngai thank you so much
Thil moi deuh mel tha deuh na deuh kan hua afan sap kan pia thil thing deuh kan hua afa zo kan ti hi ka ti nge ti kha long ai ta zo mai mai la mi zo thon thu ngai kha thin a chia thin ban in parlok ta mi zo thon thu mi zo la ngai kha thin nan ban pha de nok sin deuh okay ti ni kun lai chon mi zo la kha ngai kha so we'll go to our final round before we open the Q&A round. We wrap it up, okay? So the final round before we wind up, this is just a few sentences I'd like to say. Now, educating people, this is the topic of our discussion, is most meaningful when it grows from their own cultural soil. In the Mizo context, native narratives, folk tales, songs, proverbs, myths and oral histories have long functioned as informal yet very, very powerful pedagogical tools. They nurtured discipline, courage, respect for community norms, and give a strong sense of collective responsibility. Through storytelling, moral codes were internalized, social harmony was reinforced, and identity was sustained through generations. The transition to formal education introduced during the colonial and missionary period did not erase these indigenous foundations. Rather, literacy and translation enabled oral traditions to be documented, preserved, and shared beyond the community. Translation played a crucial role in safeguarding cultural memory while allowing Mizo knowledge systems to enter broader intellectual and educational discourse. Educating a people is not merely about institutional schooling or literacy acquisition. It is about nurturing identity, values, and continuity. At this point, I would like to invite our panelists, starting from Professor Margaret, to take turns in making their final comments on the theme of our conversation, that is, educating a people.
Educating a people, I think, and especially from the natives' narrative, is something which is very, very inherent, something that is absolutely significant for each and every one of us here. The whole concept of education, and especially from the narrative that we are on today, we have to understand that it is something that is dynamic. It's not something which is static, it's something that will be forever continuous. So at this point, I think it is good to remind ourselves that no matter what governments may come to power, no matter what kind of educational policies may come, because governments have come and gone, administrations have come and gone, educational policies have also come and gone. Also, education is in the making, and as all of us now are. And we will also continue to play, we will be playing our roles also as educationists, we will be forming, framing a lot of things. But it is important also to understand that at the heart of the matter, when we're talking about education, number one, it is dynamic, it is also lifelong, and also important to understand that for each and every one of us, the cultural sensibilities, we have to be true to ourselves, we've got to be true to our culture. In Kim, centering more policy par in the name of education, anga anron langza zong so tehi himani ayin vote bank antam mawanga until ti thea wanga heta anron da ka tongpo pom tura ni talawa kantan hian na thaim tila ya ka thei patu pin himani hian kan evaluate jangai ve ta a tin chumi inkara chuanin himani hi tunge kan ni tia hen kan chian manga ya mizo kan ni chuanin mizo identity te khami mizo ness te kha tin nge kan seng lu theyang tin mizo kan ni pia lama kha north east om kan ni ta a so wang chan khami north eastern paradigm kha tu kan soi angin ingkin ma hi ma ni ya hianin in seng lu a ti lo chu kha ni lo khan chuanin hei one india te kan kita a han soi zau ta ilangin ing tiklai ma hian one india kan ni theilo ti hi achiang ani kha kan pom tur bok ani one india ti idea hi kan ti chuanin uniformity ani a cohesiveness ani a chu wang chan ke ma ni kha ke ni ai nan tam a policy framers hi chu wang chuanin one india anga kan chu dwal dwal kan the dwal don chuanin ke ma ni indigeneity te ke ma ni kan ni na individuality te kan cultural identity hi min chin gal dona min kan bo dona one india ti te one policy ti te hi chu a theilo ti la ya te kha abi takin natives narrative atang chuanin this appeal comes from the heart. Thank you.
Tuna Professor Margaret is say kam takha karirulo me kania educating a people kan han tia chu ta chuan education chung chang chu seina nangai to lova kan thiam na kan zir chua hian eng mi hringa nge nin siam ti lai he poi mo lai chu ni ta ni chuta chuan natives narratives kan ti chuan being Mizo a hi Mizo kan ni nei atik nge tur ni kan pianga chuta chuan kan way of thinking a kha avasap viau e mon sap tong kan zinga wanga avasap viau ni lovin Mizo tho si khan mo kan ngai to na zong zong a kha entinan tlom ngai na kan ti ke aya upa za na kan ti ke tu na yan education ni ani lo zong in kan la a tam tak ki chuan tu nge ani bi ti tak e ma chuan kan te ni te ro ti tak e ma chuan kan ti hi ti tak ta chuan Mizo ba ki kan ni don lo bani mo ti tak e ma chuan B.Ed section A khakania ma se ti tak ta chuan Mizo kan ni ti kha kan share chen ngai ni ta a chu the native narratives a chuan kan thiam na le kan sir san na hi kan Mizo na ti he tu ani anga ya chu kan Mizo ne na ken te la chu ni chi na kan soi kan traditional values ho kha kan chang kan san tu ren lo chang kan san ka ti wa cha khan in chang kan san ni chuan in chang kang lo dina ni don ni mo chulai ta ka chu ka sei do a chung kwa nu le pa music to ka zir sang khotlang ngai ven lo khopa le khasir ko san music to le ka in zir sang kan ni chuan kha Mizo culture na adu ngai lo ani nu le pa ta na rin tla rod tla khotlang ina an thamuan pui ko san in nga na chung ho lung tu pathum ma chu Mizo ina ke mani kan he na em tu ra ni a chu kan education hian a keng te tura the native narratives a khan family community society the church kha shedanang u pin ka chari chuni
chu Isaac level mo nia muang henin ISC student kan nia chuanin sabela chuanin helai penal lisa chu te hi mo chuanin kan mi ngai san pe chon chua ti kha kan sei mo sedua chuanin madam Diktei khanin Indian kan ni lo e mon ya kan ro lo chu mana tu sei pakhat ka ngai tha ka chuanin kan national anthem ako henin north east people and this kan napakhat ba om he mate so ani tak pen ka kelawa so kan Indian ya min share bak lo mani o ti na ngai to na kan ti ra tu kan sei di masa mai me ya chuanin tlong mana chung chang kha aron se ya I ta zona a ba chun an mani ngai dan ha ka se tua I tlong mai na kan ti chuanin Mizo I kan nun kun kan culture a bet ani ya kan chu nga chuanin kan sei I kan zo du na lai tak chu I Christian na chung chang ne hen ya I kan sei zau lo nga I ko khana in mang tak le I hey Mizo wa chuanin ko I fel hi har lo wa ko kan le ko tlang kai hang chong fel kan ni mai ta I khata khanin I Christian na le kan tlong mai na hi I ai meram tu na ni I yang zong ha kan sei chi ta tu ta chuanin chen chu to khana in hang biao si I tlong mai na ai mi kan ti a definition va shel de si hi anong chi ta kha ha nge I Mizo wa he tam tak kha tanom de to ni ka sia ke ma experience kha ha nge in ngai da I ko fan le khotla ha I hang ko silo ko khana fa active biao si ko khotla ha I tang kai vak si lo ka tiang ha an tam via wa ka tiang ha nge in ngai da kan tlong maiนั่นแหละกันคริสเตียนนะฮีไอ้เมเบลอีต้นเจี๊ยเราเนี่ที่ข้าเราในตาเสียที่ส่วนนี้ปัจจุบันส่วนนี้ดูพ้นช้างเวลาอีมีเจ้ากันนี่คุ้งกันนี่น่าชิมช่วยกัน value อาฮีอีกันตัวเล่ฟ้าเตล่อีหันกันนัดตุชาโต้เกมอีไล่แต่ข้ากันเราสดเลยนะ
อ๋อเนี่ยลองเลยนะสงสารอ่ะค่ะนี่Mizo in kan ni ti ta tua ka ta ni china khan ton sia ta tanga ka ti chana chu kan soyanga nikum kha khotsiat vak lai khan lung le tanga kan lo hong hi konga zan ni kan ria kan ni chu kong chia wang khan kan tum lo de bin จวนกับทุกอย่างกับพอรำลายตีติดกับพวกเสียกันข้าตาขันมิโซตาเราหนีเงี้ยเงี้ยตีก็เชียร์นั่นซูไว้ตังเวหินออกมาไว้หันติดตัวปีละมิโซวินาตีตัวรักันตีไม่อย่างข้าอันตีเวไม่ละวันนี้ไว้ตรงง่ายน้องเวเท้ากันตีอะมาเสอันน้องเวเท้ากันตีจวนอาเช่นขัดอันตรงง่ายตีนั่นเนี่ยมิโซกันตรงง่ายกันตีจวนกันไว้กันตรงง่ายตีนั่งข้าเราดีตานี่จุดตาจนตัวในเสียข้าคริสเตียนกันคริสเตียนน่ะอินมังตักตักเตส่วนละมามังอินอันตรงง่ายโตหรือว่านี่ที่ไม่ยังทานไหลมีเสติเตเงหมออาคัดเสียงปอลนตาเสจุลายจอนเกจอนกันไงหมอที่นั่นจุกัน education อาการเล่เดชินี่ละตุนมาอากันจิรชินดานอังเตเฮ้ยสกูลกันกันไลเกนี่กันแล้วขัดจุไรต่อหม้อปอลตาเสข้างอาขัดจอนนัดทอเตกิบไม่ค่ากันติชินั่นนี่ตัวไหนจวนนู่นเลยป้าพ่อเห็นกันฟาติฮีนังนี่จงกำตะกินกันติโซฟลุตุกะอาจิติตูเต้นอันมองอันสิลสักโลเจ้าอันนี้บาร์รูมตีไฟจุค่อยลำหม้อข้าคัดอย่างอันนี้วางคานตรงไงและปอฮีชุ่มกว่าจังเตนู่นเลยป้าจังเตียนกันโลชาวบ้านจุเหลานี่ละวิ่งกันโลอ้อกันโลฮีอ่ะเหลาอมันนี่หม้อตรงไงเนี่ยกันเราที่เราตักเจตาจู่ๆกันคริสเตียนนะเนนคริสเตียนให้มีกัน religion ไอ้มายันเกจวนนู่เลยป้าจังเลยขดลางอ่ะพอเอ็นตีนันซีร์นะกันไงตัวนะโซงอ่ะยันพอสมปนิซิร์ตูริจูมีที่น่ะพอไลวาร์เวลลีเซที่อังจีเตเฮ้ยมีที่น่ะพอไลวาร์ค่ะอีก็ฮันไงตัวเต้ละให้มิที่รองสุดที่จะมิที่สมทุมเอ็นตีนานอันองเตียนได้บาดปุยง่ายเฮียงสังเงอมังโอจุกุมขัดนี่จะทุ่มสมรูปบางอย่างเฮียงสังเงยังเลยจุมีกันเตียวางจนขาเละขจิรตัวละกันตีตุกนาจานตรงไงให้กันหลงโจกันมีที่กันริรู้สนองเชียงนี่กันคริสเตียนตีเนนจนเกจจนก็ก็ไก่ปล่อยเจ้าหรือว่ามาเสกันอินสิตีชาวนายานakong olsam at halam ko nga chaw at salam ko nga pay ti te kay ni chan kan lo zit chinaka akong pay ri wat ti kan lo zit ti ko en family tang po in chu ti ni chan lo ngai ai chuan mo zinga exer zinga in soi ai chuan thoma in soi ai chuan zoi sa thok lai kan du ang deu le kan tui se pe mo ti kha kan ri ru lo oma at sang chen ka se lo wa christian na ne ni chuan ki chuanก็ไงต่อจองหรือว่ามาเสคริสเตียนนักโกรมังโฮค่ะอันสอบตักนักสังคม family จังอินนี่อินกัชยาอีตินกัน education อาจารย์กันอินสิติโตตลอดที่เป็นลีบีค่ะอีอาจารย์เองกัชเราก็ไงด่านี่สิthank you
อาจารย์ตรงไงนักเรียนขั้นจนปีดิกเตขันวันเสย์มากระต่ายขั้นจนกระเสย์ต่อลงไม่ยังที่มามี culture ที่กันอินเจติโตเข็มช่วงกว่าจังอินที่ไล่ยเตปอกค่ะกันไงก็เฮ้ยไงก็ฉันจู่กันยินเสียที่โตเก็มกันตีตัวยันตัวน่าสอดตัวเพคานจอนเนี่ยชัดเจนให้นูเล่ปาเต้กันอูเต้ลำปางอาคานินอารมณ์กอกตาฮักอดีตลุตัวกันมาเสกี่มานี่ชิมายานินเองอังร้อนพอหินใจลังยินนาวปังเต้ปอนิตาอังยิลังยินหมออุปเดี๋ยวเช็ดเตปอนิตาอังยิลังยินอินพุตนั่นนุ่นที่กันในตำลุตุกยันกษยาเหตุยันจอนินอาจารย์จู่ตรงนี้ลินเสียที่รังกับปีเต้นอมโตโลล้อมกับปูเต้นอมโตโลล้อมหมอกับปีเล็กปูเต้นเองมาสวยโลล้อมนู่นแหละป้าเต้นกันตีรัวฮานี่มานี่ตีไทยที่อาตำลุตุกตานี่ที่นั่นหันสวยแต่ไม่ละมานี่ตอนเชียตายันอาจารย์เบียยันกษยาเหตุลายที่จู่พายอมเร่งกันนี่ตากับป้าที่พายยันนี่service ตาIndian Revenue Service ยันนี่มิโซลุนก็เสด็จอันนี้เฮียส่วนin 1962อลูตาส่วนนี้ข้ามีหัวข้างพายเทรนนิ่งนุปุยเตปอกันนูเตเนนันอินเนนเตปอพายนักเกนี่เตปอยพายกันออเซอร์จ้ะติดส่วนนี้น่าก็รอนสมยานินกันรอนเล็กสวรรค์กับป้าเป็นชินคานินมาเสขัดติลายคานินจุดมานี่ตนเชียเละมานี่ขัดยามานี่ตัวตัวรถหามาอินติวางสว่างเดวินมาเสอาเซียนเรื่องน่ะอันนี้ลายก็เชียจุดที่มานี่เราระหว่างพอยานินจงเทียมเหล่าดูขัดจุนใจแล้วจงกันยินหันจันตาอันนี้เรา กันเทียมเราเทสักสุดนี่อาจารย์จุอัตตั้งตักคติไลส์คานินมิโซชุ่งกว่าภายละมาอมคติไลต์ไปการจนcivil service มิโซที่อันตำลุกตุกันนี่ตัวนั้นยังจน civil service จังตัวยังกันนี่น้อยกันอินนอร์ข้างหุ่นไลค์ขจูนี่แล้วว่าก็ปาร์ตี้ generation 1960s 70s 80s แต่ไปการจนนี่ civil service Indian civil service ยังมิโซที่อันตำลุกตุกจีนตานี่ส่วนจากกันอมสาวว่ามาสิลังอินพายกันอมปุยตั้งตักขันจวนนี่อันฟ้าที่สุดสวยแล้วว่าอันฟ้าที่พอเห็นตุนแต่งานนี่มิโซจงที่อันก็เทียมแล้วว่าอันบัตรบอกกันนี่ข้าก็อันนี้ตัวเรื่องอันติดตัดตานี่จุดเด็มล้ำเละเด็มเราล้ำปังจุดนังมาลีทิ้งลงอาคานี่อิน decision กันนี่ทำไมเสมาสิก็สวยอมเสียจุอามิชิงอายันทีนี้อาที่พอเห็นกันนู่นเลยฟ้าที่กันอินเทียมตัวนี่ที่เขาไปคัดมาก็มีกรุบบุญโลเร่มาสิลังอินที่มิโซกันนี่รัวเนี่ยนี่กัน culture เตกัน religion เตกัน heritage เตอังเตก็จะอาคาตกจนมินชิลที่มานี่อาคารกันรัวๆอาคารอินตัวมามิโซกันเทียมอาคารซับจงกันเทียมฮินดีเตปอกันเทียมทิ้งกระป๋าโพสิงอาคารสันสกฤตเตปอกันละเบงกอลีเตปอฮิกันละจีนตานี่สุดอย่างส่งจนมาเสกขัดติลายอาคารนี่ข้ามีกันก็ลากระบะกันจงดังกันเทียมมากันที่มานี่จงกันเทียมเราผ่าเราว่าทิ้งจงดังกันบังไงสังลุรคานี่ดีเรากันนู่นเลยป้าที่ข้างข้าก็เอ็นติกไล่เป็นมิโซอินนี่ที่อินเทียงไงเจโรอินเทียมังไงติไล่ค่ะเอาอมโหลเร่งมาเสมานี่อันนี้อินดิวิชวลอะไรนี่อินตูดานะที่เอาอมเปไม่ตาส่วนบางส่วนบุญนะนี่กันจะว่านี่อภัยหมอกติที่จุuniversity ที่กันทบตาข้างกันจะไล่แต่เป็นตักกันอมที่นี่นี่มาจะบอกค่ะดูilang chuanin an son thiang ti ang khan ni technological development te til dang te po ka mase phut na no ni atam hi ka tia anu apa in min shil lawa ti vel ang zong song te kan chan nu kan tho pui nu tu na chuanin a pension to a soi chu piam tu ya na soi mase a dik ve me mi kan ti ti na tunna ya yan chan ti diktei soft te tia khati lai kan chan soft ti kha ala lar vak lawa ni mase pension ma kan na soi ti na kan society ina mizo society ina kan chat na ber hi chu kan culture fo kan chat lo na hi chu na chan hi chu ke ni huna chon nu pa kan tia chon kanu ka pa kan ti hak na ka mase anu a pa ti an tam lu tu khan ni ti bua ya ni ati chi na chu ta chon kan za ba hin ki ma tiam ya nin in en na nin a chai in ka sia ka dong ne
session dang om awang ni live session tu kan ti top don to nga mani chan chin so hi nuam lawa masu soi an discussion atanga no highlight pakhat ka do chu kan chan chin ni in an shadu ni in an cheta on atanga an lo lu ta tourist nga lo lo yan an mani ang de khyak kwak sap ang de khyak kwak ki mu an sak lo ti mani kan ni ang hi mu an sak hi first hand knowledge กันเลยอะก็ฝากไปที่ทราบประมาณสิละจะด่าจวนมีที่มาชนด่านที่เป็นแบบเรซนันที่นักมาชนด่านที่เป็นแบบเรซนันด่าจวนอันเรซนันจวนมีที่กันอีกสองบอลด่านเตะจานนั้นกันอีกไล่บอลคุยด่านเตะอีกว่าเนี่ยทานกันไล่ด่านเตะเองกิมค่ะอัศยะมีดุยด่าอินอันง่ายขาดีso bang kan native narrative ni in an shadow an ngai sang tu i vong ta dang u ti kha kan session top na sai de ni e ka me